finally track him down to set up a re-interview. And he says, I'm not going to look at any photos because I can't identify him. Yeah, we got beat up in the LA Times over that.
The unaliving of Tupac shocked the world, but the investigation that followed may be even more disturbing. Years of dead ends, missing witnesses, and unanswered questions all pointed to one conclusion: this case went cold. But according to a former FBI agent, that's not what really happened. The investigation didn't die. It was hushed. Who had the power to stop it? What were they hiding? Join us as we expose the forces that made sure justice would never come. The night the truth went quiet. The streets of Las Vegas glowed under neon lights on September 7th, 1996, and it was supposed to be a celebration. Mike Tyson had just won his fight. Tupac was riding high, heading to a nightclub after party, and the energy was electric. The city felt alive. Then everything shattered. At 11:15 that night, a white Cadillac pulled up alongside Tupac's black BMW at a red light. The intersection was Flamingo Road and Colville Lane, and witnesses saw the passenger window roll down. Then came the gunfire. 13 shots tore through the night, and 4 of them hit Tupac. The car sped away into darkness, chaos erupted. People screamed, cars scattered, and blood pooled on the leather seats. Tupac was rushed to the hospital, and for 6 days he fought while doctors worked around the clock. Fans gathered outside, praying, hoping, refusing to believe. But on September 13th, he died. He was only 25 years old. In those first hours after the shooting, police moved fast as witnesses were questioned and evidence was collected. Detectives promised the public they would find answers. The case felt urgent. The world was watching, and justice seemed inevitable. But then something changed. The momentum slowed, calls to witnesses stopped being returned, and leads that seemed promising went nowhere. Files sat untouched on desks. Detectives who had been pushing hard suddenly pulled back, and the energy drained from the investigation. It wasn't dramatic, it was quiet, almost invisible. Weeks became months as the public waited for arrests, but none came. They waited for updates, but there was only silence. The case that had started with so much attention began to fade into the background, and people assumed it went cold because there were no answers. But what if that wasn't true? What if the case didn't go cold by accident? What if it was pushed into the shadows on purpose? Former investigators would later admit something disturbing, that they had leads, they had suspects, they had witnesses who saw things, but every time they got close, something stopped them. Resources disappeared, pressure came from above, and doors that should have been opened suddenly closed. It was as if someone didn't want the truth to come out. This wasn't just an unsolved case, it was a case that was never allowed to be solved. But while the investigation was quietly dying, one story was spreading everywhere. A name was being repeated so many times, it became fact. That story would control the narrative for decades, and it might have been a lie from the very beginning. The story everyone was told. Within days of Tupac's death, a narrative took over as it spread through the streets, through the media, through police departments. One name kept coming up again and again: Orlando Anderson, and the story was simple. Supposedly hours before the shooting, Tupac and his crew had jumped Anderson in the MGM Grand Casino. Security cameras caught the fight, and Anderson was seen on the ground getting kicked and punched. The theory followed naturally that this was revenge, that Anderson came back with a gun, that he shot Tupac. Case closed. The story made sense. It was clean, it was easy to understand, and most importantly, it was easy to repeat. News channels ran with it, newspapers printed it, and people on the streets believed it. The more it was told, the more real it became, because repetition has power. Say something enough times and it stops needing proof. It just becomes the truth everyone knows. But behind the scenes, not everyone was convinced. Detectives who worked the case had doubts because the timeline didn't quite fit. Witness statements didn't line up perfectly, and some people who were there that night told different versions of what happened. Physical evidence raised questions that the Anderson story didn't answer. Yet every time investigators tried to look in other directions, they were pushed back toward the same narrative. Orlando Anderson, the MGM fight. Revenge. Nothing else? It wasn't just police, as the media kept reinforcing the same angle. Documentaries focused on Anderson, articles repeated the casino footage, and theories about gang retaliation dominated every discussion. Alternative explanations were dismissed as conspiracy theories, and the story became so dominant that questioning it felt pointless. Years later, cracks would start to show, as people who were there that night came forward with different accounts. Former law enforcement would admit they had been steered toward Anderson deliberately, and evidence that didn't fit the narrative would surface, raising uncomfortable questions about who benefited from keeping the focus on one man. The Anderson story did something powerful in that it gave the public an answer, it gave the media a villain, and it gave investigators a target. But it may have also done something else. It may have protected the real culprits by making sure no one looked anywhere else. Because while everyone was focused on Orlando Anderson, something much darker was happening inside Death Row Records. Witnesses were disappearing, people were refusing to talk, and those who did speak up were starting to turn up dead. The official story pointed outward toward the streets and gang violence, but the real danger might have been coming from inside the very organization that was supposed to protect Tupac. Inside Death Row's wall of silence. Phil Carson had been in law enforcement for decades, and he had seen his share of difficult investigations, but nothing prepared him for what they encountered with Death Row Records. The moment Tupac died, it was like a fortress went up. Walls so high and so thick that getting information became nearly impossible. The investigators needed witnesses. They needed people who were there that night, who saw what happened, who knew the players involved. But every time they tried to reach someone connected to Death Row, they either vanished or refused to cooperate. Phone numbers stopped working, addresses led nowhere, and people they knew had information suddenly claimed they didn't remember anything. It wasn't just reluctance, it was fear. And Carson could feel it in every conversation. Witnesses who might have talked were being threatened, intimidated, pressured to stay silent. Some disappeared completely. They left town without telling anyone where they were going, and when investigators finally tracked them down, they were terrified. Others weren't so lucky. They ended up dead under suspicious circumstances, and the message became crystal clear to everyone else. Talk to the police and there will be consequences. What made it worse was that Death Row wasn't just a record label. It operated like something else entirely. They had security teams, armed personnel, and a network that seemed to know every move the investigators made. When Carson and his team tried to locate witnesses, they often had to go through Death Row's own people, the very organization they were investigating. Think about that for a moment. They were asking potential suspects to help them find witnesses against them. It was backwards, it was dangerous, and it gave Death Row complete control over what they could and couldn't access. Carson remembered trying to interview former employees, people who had left the label and should have felt safe to talk. Even they were scared, looking over their shoulders, speaking in hushed tones, refusing to go on record. They knew what happened to people who broke the code of silence. They had seen it firsthand, and they weren't willing to become the next example. The pattern was unmistakable. Every potential breakthrough led to a dead end. Every witness either recanted or disappeared, and every piece of evidence that might have pointed toward Death Row insiders somehow got muddied or lost. It felt orchestrated, like someone on the inside was making sure they never got close to the truth. But the strangest part wasn't just the wall of silence. It was one specific decision made on the night of the shooting, a security choice so reckless that it still haunted Carson and his team to this day. The security decision that changed everything. In all his years investigating organized crime and high-profile cases, Phil Carson had never seen a security decision quite like this one. On the night Tupac was shot, his security team was allegedly told not to carry weapons, and when Carson first heard that, he couldn't believe it. You have one of the biggest rap stars in the world, someone who had been shot before, someone with known enemies, riding through Las Vegas after a major boxing match, and his security was unarmed. Carson was clear about something. Professional security doesn't work that way. When you're protecting a high-value target, especially someone in Tupac's position, you arm your team because that's basic protocol. You prepare for the worst-case scenario, you create layers of protection, and you make sure that if something goes wrong, your people can respond. Telling security not to carry weapons doesn't just reduce protection, It eliminates it almost entirely. What was even more disturbing was that some bodyguards weren't even aware of this decision until that night. They showed up expecting to do their jobs properly, only to be told at the last minute to disarm. Others protested. They knew how dangerous this was, they understood the risks, and they pushed back against the order. One bodyguard, Frank Alexander, actually refused to go along with it, and according to reports, he was removed from the detail that night for not complying. Think about what that means for a moment. A trained security professional recognized the danger, tried to do his job the right way, and was taken off the assignment because he wouldn't leave his client unprotected. That's not normal procedure. That's not how legitimate security operations work, and it raised massive red flags for investigators looking back at what happened. Carson and his team had to ask the hard questions. Who gave that order? Who had the authority to make security stand down? And why would anyone think that was acceptable? The answers they got were vague, inconsistent, and unsatisfying. Some people claimed it was a venue requirement, others said it was a management decision, and some denied the order was ever given at all. This wasn't just negligence in Carson's view, this felt deliberate. It felt like someone wanted Tupac vulnerable, exposed, unable to fight back when the moment came. Strip away the armed security, put him in a car with no real protection, and wait for someone to take the shot. But who had the power to make that decision? Who was in charge of death row's security that night? And what else did they control that investigators were only beginning to understand? The man between two worlds. Phil Carson knew that solving complex cases often came down to finding the right informant, someone on the inside who could provide access, intelligence, and credibility. In the Tupac investigation, that person was Reggie Wright Jr., and on the surface, he seemed perfect for the role. Wright was the head of security for Death Row Records. He knew everyone, he saw everything, and he had direct access to information that investigators desperately needed. But Wright wasn't just Death Row security, he was also something else entirely. He was a federal informant working with the FBI and other agencies, feeding them information about the inner workings of the label. Carson had worked with Wright directly, had built a relationship with him, and had come to rely on his insights into what was happening inside that organization. Wright seemed cooperative, professional, and willing to help bring justice to a complicated situation. The problem was that Wright occupied a unique position. He stood between two worlds. On one side, he was Death Row's protector, the man responsible for keeping the label's secrets safe, for managing security, for controlling who had access and who didn't. On the other side, he was law enforcement's window into that world, the trusted source who could guide investigations, point detectives in the right direction, and help make sense of a chaotic environment. Carson later realized how much power that gave Wright, how much control he had over what investigators saw and what they didn't. Wright could share certain details while holding back others. He could emphasize some leads while downplaying alternatives. And he could shape the entire narrative of the investigation simply by choosing what information to provide. He was the gatekeeper, and in cases like this, the gatekeeper has more influence than almost anyone else. What made it more complicated was that Wright had his own interests to protect. He wasn't just an observer reporting facts. He was deeply embedded in Death Row's operations. He made decisions that affected the label's security, and he had relationships with everyone involved. If something went wrong on his watch, if security failed in a way that looked suspicious, Wright had every reason to make sure investigators looked elsewhere. Carson had seen this pattern before in other cases, where informants used their position to protect themselves while appearing to cooperate. They give you just enough to seem helpful. They point you toward convenient suspects, and they make sure you never look too closely at their own role in what happened. It's a delicate game, and if played correctly, the informant comes out clean, while everyone around them takes the fall. The question that haunted Carson later was simple, but terrifying. What if Wright wasn't helping them find the truth? What if he was leading them away from it? Witnesses who would not repeat the lie. Frank Alexander had been part of Tupac's security team, and unlike others who stayed silent or changed their stories, Alexander became a problem for those controlling the narrative. He knew what happened that night, he had been there. And most importantly, he refused to repeat the version of events that was being pushed by Death Row and their associates. The official story centered heavily on an incident at the MGM Grand Casino, where Tupac and his crew had allegedly jumped Orlando Anderson after the Tyson fight. This altercation was presented as the motive, the spark that led to the shooting hours later. It was clean, it fit the gang retaliation narrative, and it gave investigators a clear suspect to focus on. But Alexander's account didn't match what others were saying, and he wouldn't back down. According to sources familiar with the investigation, there were recorded calls where Alexander was being pressured to change his story, to retell the MGM incident in a way that supported the Anderson theory. The pressure wasn't subtle. It was direct, persistent, and designed to get him to conform to the narrative that had already been established. But Alexander resisted. He insisted on telling what he actually saw, and he refused to embellish or alter details to fit someone else's version of events. This created a major problem for those who needed the story to stay consistent. If one credible witness contradicts the official narrative, it opens the door to doubt, it makes investigators ask questions, and it threatens to unravel everything. Carson and other agents began to sense panic among those connected to death row. There was urgency in getting Alexander to cooperate, and when he wouldn't, the tension escalated. What made Alexander's position even more significant was his credibility. He wasn't some random bystander. He was a trained professional who had worked close protection for high-profile clients. He understood security protocols, he knew how to observe and remember details, and his testimony carried weight. If he said something didn't happen the way others claimed, investigators had to take that seriously. The cracks in the narrative became harder to ignore as Alexander continued to push back. Other witnesses started to notice the inconsistencies, and some began asking their own questions, and the tight control over the story began to slip. Carson saw how one honest voice, one person willing to stand firm, could threaten an entire constructed reality. It showed how fragile the official story really was, how much it depended on everyone saying the same thing, and how quickly it could collapse if just one person told a different truth. But maintaining control over witnesses and narratives required more than just pressure and intimidation. It required understanding how law enforcement actually worked and how informants could manipulate entire investigations from the inside. Informants, misdirection, and a broken system. Phil Carson had worked with informants throughout his career, and he understood how valuable they could be in complex investigations. They provided access to closed worlds, they offered intelligence that couldn't be obtained any other way, and they helped agents navigate dangerous environments. But Carson also knew the dark side of this relationship, how informants could manipulate the very system designed to catch criminals, and how they could use their position to protect themselves while appearing to cooperate. The informant system operates on trust. Agents rely on their sources to provide accurate information, to guide them toward the truth, and to help build cases against dangerous people. But what happens when an informant has their own agenda? When they're feeding you selective truths while hiding the most important facts? When they're steering you away from answers rather than toward them? Carson had seen it happen before, and he was starting to believe it had happened with the Tupac investigation. History was full of examples where trusted FBI informants had led agents in the wrong direction. Whitey Bulger in Boston had been an FBI informant for years. While running a criminal empire, he used his relationship with law enforcement to eliminate rivals, to avoid prosecution, and to maintain power. The FBI thought they were using him, but in reality, he was using them, feeding them information about other criminals while protecting his own operations. It took years before anyone realized how badly they had been played. Carson saw disturbing parallels in the Tupac case, where the investigation seemed to follow a similar pattern. Agents were being pointed toward street-level suspects, toward gang members and known criminals who fit a convenient narrative. Meanwhile, questions about what happened inside death row, about security failures and suspicious decisions, were being downplayed or ignored entirely. The focus stayed external, looking outward at the streets and gang violence, while the possibility of an inside job was dismissed as unlikely or unsupported. The system had failed because it was designed to trust informants, to believe that people providing information were doing so in good faith. But when an informant is also a potential suspect, when they have direct involvement in the events being investigated, that trust becomes a weapon they can use against you. They control what you see, what you believe, and ultimately where your investigation leads. Carson later realized they might have been chasing a ghost on purpose, following leads that were designed to go nowhere, pursuing suspects who may have had nothing to do with the unaliving. The real culprits could have been hiding in plain sight, protected by the very person who was supposed to be helping investigators find them. And as the investigation stalled and the official narrative solidified, one person who could have disrupted everything was about to become a very inconvenient problem. Orlando Anderson's final chapter. Orlando Anderson had become the center of the Tupac unaliving narrative. His name was attached to the case in every news report, every documentary, every street corner conversation. The story was simple, and it had stuck. Anderson had been jumped at the MGM Grand. He came back for revenge. He pulled the trigger. It was the explanation that satisfied the public, gave the media their villain, and allowed the investigation to have a clear suspect even without an arrest. But there was a problem that was growing larger as time went on. And that problem was Anderson himself. He was still alive, he was still talking, and most importantly, he was denying everything. Anderson gave interviews where he insisted he had nothing to do with the shooting. He maintained his innocence publicly, and he even testified under oath that he wasn't involved. For those who needed the Anderson story to remain the official truth, this was becoming increasingly dangerous. Suge Knight was preparing for an appeal, his legal team was building their case, and there was a real possibility that Anderson might be called to testify again. If Anderson stood in court and repeated his denial, if he provided an alibi or evidence that cleared him, the entire narrative could collapse. The case that law enforcement had built, the story that had been told for years, would suddenly have no foundation. Questions would be asked, alternative theories would resurface, and investigators might be forced to look in directions they had been avoiding. Then something happened that solved this problem permanently. Orlando Anderson was unalived in a shootout in Compton on May 29, 1998, less than 2 years after Tupac's death. The circumstances were presented as gang-related violence, another casualty of street warfare. Nothing unusual for that environment. But the timing raised questions that were never fully answered. What made it more suspicious was a detail that emerged later. Reggie Wright Jr. was reportedly among the first people at the scene after Anderson was shot. For investigators looking back, this felt like more than coincidence. Wright had been the informant guiding the investigation. He had been pushing the Anderson narrative, and now Anderson was dead, just as he was becoming a liability to that story. Carson and others had to consider the possibilities. Did the story need Anderson gone to survive? Did someone decide that a dead suspect was better than a living one who kept denying involvement? Was this another convenient death in a case full of them? The questions multiplied, but the answers never came. Because once Anderson was gone, there was no one left to challenge the official version of events. But Anderson's death wasn't the only convenient outcome. While Suge Knight sat in prison and the investigation stalled, something else was happening quietly behind the scenes. Something involving money, power, and control. Following the money. While Suge Knight sat locked away in prison, something strange was happening with Death Row Records. The empire he had built, the assets he had controlled, the properties and businesses that had made him powerful, all of it was quietly changing hands. Buildings were being transferred, ownership documents were being filed, and control was shifting into new names. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't publicized, it was happening in the shadows where most people wouldn't notice. Phil Carson and other investigators who looked closely at what happened after Tupac's death began to see a pattern that looked less like chaos and more like a plan. When someone goes to prison, their business usually struggles. Partners fight over what's left, and things fall apart in messy and obvious ways. But Death Row's transition looked different. It looked organized, methodical, like someone had been preparing for this moment and knew exactly what to do when it came. Documents surfaced that raised serious questions about how legitimate these transfers actually were. Some paperwork had signatures that didn't look right. Others had dates that didn't make sense, and several transactions happened so quickly after Knight's imprisonment that it seemed almost choreographed. Former agents began to suspect this wasn't just opportunistic people taking advantage of a power vacuum, this was something that had been set up in advance. The question that haunted investigators was simple. Who really took over after Tupac died? On paper, it looked like various business entities and individuals acquired pieces of Death Row, but when you trace those connections back, they often led to people who had been close to the organization all along. It wasn't outsiders coming in to pick up the pieces. It was insiders consolidating control, while the public face of the empire sat behind bars. Carson saw this as potentially the most revealing aspect of the entire case. Unalivings can have many motives: revenge, anger, fear. But when you see money and power changing hands immediately afterward, it forces you to consider whether the unaliving was part of a larger plan. Was Tupac's death just a tragic result of violence? Or was it the catalyst that allowed certain people to take control of an empire worth millions? But perhaps the most disturbing revelation wasn't what investigators found. It was what they were prevented from finding, and who made sure they never got close enough to discover the truth. We were told to stop. Phil Carson's most chilling claim came years after the investigation had gone cold, and it was a statement that reframed everything. The investigation into Tupac's unaliving didn't just lose momentum naturally. It wasn't simply a case that went cold because leads dried up or evidence disappeared. According to Carson, investigators were actively discouraged from pursuing certain angles. They were redirected away from promising leads, and at critical moments they were told to stop. This wasn't about a lack of resources or competing priorities. This was something more deliberate. Carson described how every time they got close to uncomfortable truths, every time they started looking at people with power and connections, pressure would come from above. Supervisors would reassign agents, cases would be deprioritized, and the message became clear without ever being stated directly. Some doors were not meant to be opened. The case was never officially closed. It remained open on paper, listed as unsolved and theoretically active. But in practice, it was quietly abandoned, left to gather dust while everyone moved on to other things. The public believed investigators were still working on it, still searching for answers, still committed to justice. The reality was that the investigation had been shelved, not because it was impossible to solve, but because solving it would have required looking at people who were protected. Carson's revelation raised the most disturbing question of all. If the investigation was stopped, who had the power to stop it? Who could reach into an FBI investigation and shut down lines of inquiry? Who could protect suspects from scrutiny? Who had enough influence to make sure certain truths never came to light? These weren't street-level criminals. These weren't gang members or low-level players. This was power operating at a level that could control law enforcement itself. Sometimes the truth isn't hidden because it's unknown, Carson realized. Sometimes it's hidden because too many people already know it. The people who know what really happened have chosen silence over justice, protection over accountability, and comfort over truth. They know who unalived Tupac, they know why it happened, and they know who benefited. They've just decided that secret is worth keeping.